Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Carlos Ayala. I am the President and CEO of Growing Inland Achievement. It is a pleasure being here with you today. Growing Inland Achievement is a K-16 collaborative focused on creating economic prosperity in the Inland Empire by raising our educational attainment levels. 2 years ago, we could not have imagined where we are today in our educational system. The pandemic has created unprecedented disruption and laid bare inequities that have plagued our schools since the founding of our nation. If you recall, in the fall semester of 2020, students were struggling to achieve because of online instruction, insufficient mental health support, loneliness, disenfranchisement, and inadequate equipment. While all our students were struggling, what was most troubling was that some of our groups, especially our Black, Brown, Indigenous, foster, homeless, and low-income students, were hardest hit. In some cases, with more than 100% increases in failing grades and absenteeism, such that in some student groups, over 60% of the students were failing. And of course, all of these challenges arose during the national racial inequity awakening that occurred because of the George Floyd murder in May of 2020, which has asked us to think deeply and act on our unjust political structures and societal systems, including our educational system. And all that leads us here today and now, these webcasts that are about how we can build from this disruption a better educational system to serve our students, such as how to attend to the social emotional learning of our students by listening to student voice, or how to attend to the social emotional needs of our teachers, staffs, administrators in our educational systems. I want to thank the William Flora Hewitt Foundation for the support of these webcasts and learning. And I want to thank my colleagues from the San Bernardino County Superintendent of Schools Office and the Riverside County Office of Education offices for their support and collaboration on these projects. We couldn't do it without them. Today, we consider an important component of the development of pedagogy, and that is the relevance of the curriculum to the students. To be effective educators, we must first connect with our students and then follow with the content. Connection before content. So I'm really happy that today we have Nicole Anderson, an expert in educational equity. In 22 years of service in education, Nicole has served as a developer and a facilitator of professional learning services, such as an advocate for educational equity work in numerous ways all across the nation. She recently held the position as the first diversity and equal access executive in the history of ACSA, Association of California School Administrators. Her work also includes the development of a research team that provides research-based content and conducts case studies of educational leaders around the state on their journey to closing educational equity gaps. As a practitioner, Nicole served as an elementary principal in Vallejo, California, where she also held numerous other positions as a site administrator for over 10 years. She was also a leadership teacher, Spanish teacher, and activities director for 6 years at Jesse Bethel High School in Vallejo. She follows in her grandfather's footsteps as an advocate for equity and social justice for students of color, as well as for all marginalized groups. Today, she will speak to us about culturally relevant teaching and learning. After her presentation, we'll take questions on an app called Pigeonhole, and that Pigeonhole link should probably be in the chat. You'll be able to vote on your favorite question. Then Assistant Superintendent Mickey Embody from the San Bernardino County Superintendent of Schools Office, as well as Assistant Superintendent Amanda Carradine from the Riverside County Office of Education, will pose these questions and follow-ups to Nicole. The link is in the Pigeonhole chat. So without further ado, I would like to invite Nicole Anderson forward. Nicole, to you.
Thank you, Dr. Ayala. I appreciate the introduction and just really excited to just be a part of the journey and lock arms with you and all who are across the county of Riverside, San Bernardino, and really all across the state and nation who have stayed focused on this work. There's been a lot going on, a lot of distractions, I call it. I'm always, in high hopes that people are staying healthy and safe right now more than ever. Because ultimately we need our equity leaders to be healthy. We need you in the trenches. We need you to be in this space to fight this battle for our students. As Dr. Ayala, introduced me in thinking about my history and the shoulders I stand on, I come to you as a descendant of Mr. Jesse Bethel and many others, but specifically my grandfather, who I've had the pleasure of starting my career at a high school named after him in Vallejo, which is in the Northern California area for those of you that haven't visited yet. I had the distinct pleasure of being inspired by his work and the seeds he planted to really advocate for not only kids of color, but really all students based on their needs. And in my journey to this space, I'm really honored to have locked arms with so many of you who are joining us today. Dr. Brown, appreciate you being on. Hardy Brown, thank you for being on. And so many of you, we've gotten to just come together. And I have to say, this work never gets old. It's always fresh and renewed. And here we are in a new year, happy new year to all of you. But I'm here today in great timing just to re-emphasize something that's been on my heart as an equity leader, as someone who's been doing this work for many years, as a mother of three who are going through this system, and also one who's, in the college space. The reality is that we are still in a place as equity leaders, no matter what our positions are, whether we're in the classroom, we're leaders of a school, we're leaders at the district office, the county office, it really doesn't matter our role, our school boards. The reality is that we have to continue to push ourselves to reimagine this thing called school. This is the space that we always can leverage when there's crises, right? And the crises that came a couple of years ago through COVID and a combination of racism, I call it the racial dust has been kicked up yet again. The reality is that this is an opportunity for us as educators to come together and to literally reimagine doing school differently. Much of what I'm going to share today, I often will connect to my own personal journey as a mother of students who go to school through the public school system. And one of the things that we're going to talk about today and really connect with is culturally relevant teaching and learning, and specifically thinking about how do we do that through this equity lens, knowing that kids have different needs right now. And so I'm going to share those stories kind of as we go, and I'm going to pause a few times along the journey so that you can ask questions that you want, and then we'll have some Q&A time at the very end. And so what I want to do is just ask you to sit back, relax. Hopefully you got your water, you have some snacks. I know you all are exhausted and you just probably went back to work this week, but thank you for, again, engaging in this work, because we need you as our equity leaders to be able to continue this journey together. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share a few slides just to kind of share a little context, and all of you will have access to this information, and also we'll have an opportunity to, again, ask some questions. I'll pause a few times. So I just want to remind us about this concept of reimagining student success with an equity lens, and specifically today making a connection to the classroom, the teaching and learning space. And so there's an article that often I share with folks and really encourage you to read this, The Water of System Change. And some of you may be familiar with it, where there's a fish story that you see on the screen. And it really speaks volumes about where we are in this space of public education, in this body of water we've been swimming in for so long. And the opportunity for us to really rethink how we're going to educate our kids, who are also the fish swimming in this water. And so this particular story, a fish is swimming along one day when another fish comes and says, "Hey, how's the water?" So I want you to think about that question I'm asking you as educators. How's the water right now? And I want you to think about your response throughout your journey. How are you going to answer that question? And in many ways, some of us are still in a space, including myself, of trying to reimagine, because our answer is, well, what's water? And so when we think about this, we have been swimming in these conditions of public education. This is what we've been doing. Many of us have been in this for 20 and 30 years of being an educator. And sometimes we need to pause especially when all this chaos is around us, and just unpack this question, what is water? Because the conditions that have been existing for our students for years and years and years and generations, we have to be more cognizant of the fact that they need to be interrupted. I think you all are focused on disruption, right? And disrupting those inequities in the system that have been baked in for centuries is our duty, our moral imperative. And so understanding though that we don't know everything, right? There's a lot we don't know. We're well-meaning, we love kids. None of us jumped into this to harm kids. We jumped in because we wanted to make a difference. But if we are not conscious of some of the conditions that are existing that we may not be aware of, then what happens is we perpetuate these inequitable conditions in the classrooms, by the way. And so I'm going to come to you today and talk to you from a leadership standpoint, because each one of us, no matter what our roles are, we are leaders and we impact change. And so I want you to think about what we might do to just begin to unpack, what does this word actually mean? What does this actually mean in terms of our role in this? And so let's just start with, let's just define the word equity. I use the word equity lens. It's super popular. Lots of people are hiring diversity and equity directors and coordinators, you name it. But let's just unpack what this word is. And I want you to practically, as you're taking notes, write this down as well in your journey to leading this work, to closing equity gaps in our school system, specifically in the classroom. We got to start with just, what does this word mean? What does it even look like when we go in a classroom and we say equity? What does it really mean? And so one is, as you're unpacking this word with your teams, by the way, this is not an individual journey, this is a team journey. I want you to just remember that on the journey to unpacking and defining truly what equity is, we have to ensure that we create some safe space to do this work. Please don't skip this step as you go on this journey. Okay, it is important that people who engage understand it's going to be uncomfortable, it's going to be messy, but ultimately it has to be safe. And so many of you have heard this over and over. I want you to continue to revisit it, because if we skip this step and we don't ensure the conditions are safe for people to engage, no blaming, no shaming, no victimization of who did what wrong, that won't get us anywhere. But what will get us moving forward is that we can engage and agree that this can be uncomfortable to define equity and actually start addressing the barriers and start to create actions that actually create equitable outcomes that will last. So I want to push you to think about on your journey how you are going to stay engaged, even when it's uncomfortable. How you're going to experience discomfort and be okay with that space sometimes that you don't feel like it feels good, doesn't sound good, you disagree with other people, that's fine. But ultimately, we're going to have to be okay with the discomfort, because that's how we're going to grow. Speaking our truth is going to be important. Storytelling is so powerful right now. Many people are engaged in the ancestry.com conversation. They're engaged in like their cultural identity, and we want to recognize our kids and our kids' truths. The reality is, speaking truth is important. It's going to be important to gather that information so that we can know how to better create equity for our students and for our stakeholders within the community. But without hearing the truth, it's hard to create equity for people when we don't know what they need. Now, the discomfort is that as you hear truths of others who may be different from you, that may create discomfort. And we as equity leaders have to recognize that discomfort is what's going to create the growth. So this is an ongoing journey for all of us, is as we hear people's truth, it may not be the same as mine, but I got to stay engaged. And ultimately, I know many of you are in this journey. You've been fighting this for years, and some of you are exhausted right now. Some of you are like impatient. You're like, I can't wait anymore. This is just overdue. As a mother who has just fought through this for my own kids, there are days when I'm like, this is ridiculous. Like, this has to stop. But ultimately, as leaders, we have to recognize that we got to expect and accept non-closure. This is a journey, and it's going to take time for us to be able to close equity gaps in schools and close them for good. And so just remember the people you stand, whose shoulders you stand on, because there's a lot of non-closure that many of them had, including my grandfather, who when he left this earth, he didn't get to see the fruits of his labor, but he did great work. He laid a foundation that gave me an opportunity and many, many, many others. So I want you to just stay encouraged on the journey as we get ready to unpack. What does equity mean? Now, In our session, what we're going to talk about is not only having you think about what equity means in terms of educational equity, but also we got to recognize some of the barriers. And so what we're going to do today, because it's a short space, is we're going to do that through recognizing the history, the conditions that have been existing for many years that we have to recognize in order to know how to interrupt and create then equitable strategies specifically for the classroom. And so one is just thinking about your own journey, okay, how you are going to engage in this work in defining equity, recognizing these barriers and creating equity. And these are great quotes that always remind us about how we're going to do this work. Okay, are we the John Lewis that's going to help people come along? And even with all the harm and pain that's been going on, are we going to recenter ourselves and have the capacity to forgive? Because we know that harm still is going to happen on the journey. Okay, ongoingly, because again, we're in a system where harm happens. But how are we going to build our capacity to forgive and keep staying focused? Many of you are dealing with a lot of pushback of this work. You've had narrations about critical race theory and all kinds of ways that people are not engaged in this work or may not believe in the work. Even well-meaning people who may have still created some harm in some space. We have to stay focused on ensuring that we can move this work and not hold what I call the grudges and the harm and space and the emotions on our sleeves that then get in the way of leading this work. Very important to ensure when we're thinking about our own journey and own reflection. The Ruth Bader Ginsburgs who are out there, those that will fight for what you believe in and do it in a way where you're bringing people along is often what I recommend. Because as you're trying to define equity, it's different for different people. People have different experiences. And so the reality is that how we bring people along, we can't force this work. You have to nurture the work. You can't mandate it. You can't force it. You have to lead people along. And so those strategies, how we lead this work, our strategies, even within the classroom, are things we have to think about with our teachers. We want our teachers to have culturally relevant instruction in terms of their practices. We want them to have great relationships with our kids. You can't force that. You have to create a mindset that believes in it. And so there's strategies we have to think about and be very strategic in this work. But ultimately, what we're going to try to unpack is how do we get people to come along this journey? Many of you have been fighting this and you had a lot of change. Dr. Ayala talked about the fact that when Mr. George Floyd was murdered, you had a lot of people that were in the streets like, yes, we're going to protest and we want change. And you have a lot of initiatives that have come that we would have never seen had that horrible incident not happened. And a lot of people want to change. But when we ask people to change, that's when you start to see the hands go down. You're asking me to do something different in the education system. You're asking me to rethink how I've been doing my grading practices all this time. Hold on a minute. Now we have some issues. And these are the things we got to think about. More critically, when we're asking people to be the leaders of change, what you're going to find is there's going to be very few people still standing. I come to you as someone who has gotten many calls about different public records requests, for example. Okay, people who question this work. And what I'm finding and pushing people to think about is do not waver because people don't all believe in this work. This is what leading equity is about, is you're going to be attacked, you're going to be questioned, you're going to have all these different experiences. And so I want to make sure that people keep their hands up. Yes, I want to lead this change, even if I have, the comments coming to me at board meetings, if I have people questioning me, parents questioning me about what we're doing in our schools. The reality is that we have to really own this work. And the way we have to own it is through recognizing, is leading for equity our why? And when I think about my why and your why, you're going to have to really think through this. Is this your why? Your purpose? And if it is not, then this is the journey we're going to have to work on to defining what equity is, to then create those outcomes that you want to see for your kids. And so understanding that is really important as we front load the content I want to share with you today, because leading for equity ultimately is going to require us to have a lot of reflection about who we are as leaders in this work. And so what I want to do is just kind of throw out a question for you. And as you're taking notes, I want you to continue to think about, what does equity mean to you? Because it may mean something different. We often talk about the elephant and the blind man poem and the former parable that helps us think about the fact that our blinders, remember that question, what's water, right? That blinder that I may have might get in the way of me even defining the needs for our students. So if I have students in class, they have all different needs, right? The reality is that that big elephant kind of represents like the larger concept of equity, but I know that the pieces of the elephant actually represent the different needs that our kids have, and it may be very different. And so we have to think about, what does equity actually mean? Because it may not mean the same for all kids, because all kids don't have the same needs. They could have the same ethnic background, they could have the same gender, all those labels we put on kids, and we look at our data. The reality is that every kid does not have the same need, even when they have the same demographics that show up in your data. And we'll talk about that in a moment. These two images are really helpful sometimes when we're thinking about how to define it. I encourage you, as you're doing this work, especially in the classrooms, have our students help us understand what equity is. I think in the last couple of years, we've had great opportunities to bring kids together and to, using the virtual space, listening sessions, and really engaging our students who are actually much more enlightened than even many of us were when we were younger. The reality is, ask them, and sometimes showing these images, even to our elementary kids, is important. Because when trying to teach students in a classroom, I cannot continue to assume I know what they need. And so they can tell me what equity is. Oh my goodness, we probably solved half of our educational issues and we just asked our kids. So this is always great to share as images for your students, to ask them what it means, but also as you're engaging with staff and your colleagues, continuing to define what it means. Because it may be something very different. Some have misunderstandings. Some will struggle with what equality is and think you're taking from one kid to give to another. All of those things you're going to have to wrestle with. So having common language within your organization, your districts, within schools, within the classroom is going to be really important. And again, we can't skip this step if we're going to create equity in the long run. We have to start by defining it. Give you an example of ways that we talk about this work is kind of three buckets we think about. Is like, what does it mean? And you see in the left column, we talk about, again, just basic things we should all know. In the classroom, equity is not equality, right? It is about giving people what they need. Dr. Jeffrey Duncan Andrade does that, does a great job of emphasizing giving people what they need, but also when they need it. So there's a time frame to all of this. That some people actually need more than others. And that's going to be very important in the classroom of how we use our finite resources, one teacher with 30 kids. Like, the reality is that some kids may need more time from that teacher. Some kids may need more resources from that teacher. So we got to really rethink, what does that look like? Student success is actually demonstrated in diverse ways. Now, I don't know about you, but this last couple of years have been real evident of that, is that kids didn't all learn well on distance learning. Okay, some kids who were straight A students all of a sudden turned out to be D and F students. I mean, the reality is that kids actually demonstrate their brilliance in very different ways. So we're going to have to rethink, how do we even assess what success looks like in our schools? And the concept of equity is something you're going to have to really wrestle with. The work that we're going to think about in defining this is about really intentionally shifting your mindset. Right? How you rethink what that water is, right? What's water? Well, we're gonna have to shift our mindset. We're gonna have to change policies at not only the school board level, but also down to the school site level. Our grading practices and policies, for example, is a big one we need to think about when we talk about teaching and learning. Okay, it's one thing to teach, it's another thing to assess learning. If there's a disconnect, but kids are still getting D's and F's in our system, then there's some things we got to rethink. Because ultimately equity is going to have to be seen as student success. And if we're still looking at the same practices, the same policies, and not shifting our mindset to reassessing those inequitable kind of practices, then what'll happen is we'll continue to perpetuate these inequities in the system. And we as educators cannot continue that. We have a great opportunity to leverage this moment in history to do so. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the challenges and a little bit more about what we can do, but I shared that here with you today on this screen, but I'm going to go into that a little bit deeper, but want to give you an example of what educational equity actually looks like. And I want you to think of it in this space. So I'm just going to give you an example of visual, and I'm going to actually show you this a little bit later in our session. But as you think about defining equity, just think about visualizing it in the classroom. And what I think about is, where do I start when I want to see equity happen, right? So what I think about is Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? 80+ year research, it applies to all human beings, irregardless of whatever someone's identity is. And so when you think about, is equity in the classroom for our students, let's just start with basic human needs. I can't do well if I don't have food, shelter, and clothing, right? I can't pass your test, right? I can't come into the classroom and be fully focused and engaged if I just don't have food, shelter, clothing. safety, the basics that every human being needs and deserves, by the way. And it is a moral imperative that our educators address that part of Maslow's, even with our limited resources, right? Even with our, our job descriptions don't say we have to do that. But our moral imperative is that if we want to see equitable outcomes for kids, we've got to take care of the basics. Belongingness, love, relationships, our self-esteem of our students. Very important that we look at that in terms of the concept of equity in schools. A great example, my son, who's a 9th grader now, last year, had a colleague, or a peer, I should say, in his class, 8th grade, who'd been in school with since the 2nd grade. This young man identified as a white male, did fairly decent in school, and he committed suicide. And the first thing I thought about was, what difference does it make what test scores he had or what homework he turned in if this Maslow's wasn't in place? That self-esteem, a sense of belonging and love, things were missing for this young man in our schools. And because we're more focused on the academic outcomes, we miss the whole child. And this is absolutely imperative when we talk about equitable outcomes. Those foundations, which is all human needs, they all show up in the self-actualization space, kids reaching their full potential. And this is something, again, we're going to have to reimagine in our classrooms. Getting an A or getting a 4 on a report card cannot be our only metric for success. Passing your state assessments that we have now, right? I mean, literally, this is a space where we're going to have to rethink what is success. And Maslow's really should be the first thing we use in our particular work. Now, what I'm going to break down in a little bit is the 4 indicators of equity and how we can actually apply that to the classroom. And really thinking about what are those things that correlate to closing achievement gaps, closing that disproportionate discipline gap. What are those things that really correlate to seeing equitable outcomes in our data? And so we're going to break down what the concept of cultural identity, relevance, and relationships and rigor actually are in a moment. But I want to give you an opportunity to just get a sense of what that looks like when we talk about redefining student success with an equity lens, and not necessarily thinking that this work is always going to be about the outcomes of test scores and the traditional metrics we have for student success. It's really about the whole child. And if you're stuck, just go back to research. Maslow's is wonderful research to use. Now, for those of you that haven't fully had a definition of equity, the National Equity Project is a great resource for you. They have a great definition that many school boards have actually adopted in their equity statements and their equity policies, but just kind of a sense of like, what does it mean? Well, it's pretty simple. It's about each child, right? Every individual, each kid has a name, that they get what they need to develop to their full academic or social potential. There's the top of Maslow's, right? Full academic social potential. Very simple. NEP, they actually break down what that work involves, right? So it's about making sure we can create equally high outcomes for all participants. Now, equal and equity are not the same thing, right? But when we say equally high outcomes, all those kids can see over the fence. That's the equal part, right? It's not equal of giving them the same thing. It's about they have equal outcomes, high outcomes, and you have to define what that is, that we can remove the predictability of success or failure. And the reality is that you all know your data, you know it well. I can look at your data at your schools, in your districts, across your counties, and I can probably still predict who's going to be at the bottom of the achievement gap, who's not. And maybe I'll have some outliers. But the reality is we have a system at play. It's not the kids. The kids are brilliant, but we have a system at play. How do we interrupt that predictability that we always see in the data from year to year to year? Well, that work also includes interrupting inequitable practices. You all are looking at disruption. Right? So how do we actually examine these practices and policies and examine our blind spots? Again, what's water, right? What do I not know? And then let's start looking at creating an inclusive environment that's multicultural, okay? Looking at our kids' identity and looking at all parts of who they are. And not only for our kids, but also for our adults. Our adults have to thrive in this system. If we have unhealthy teachers, social, emotionally, right? Professionally, the bandwidth and capacity, if they are not healthy, then guess what happens for our students? They don't benefit from that. So we have to see this as it's really an entire system overhaul of looking at the inequitable practices, your hiring practices, right? Your retention practices, how you spend time really cultivating a space that's healthy for our kids to come to each day. And I know that's a challenge right now. We have staff shortages right now, right? We have all of these things just trying to hold it together. But if we stay focused on equity, I guarantee through this process, we will actually start to shift the system. This is the time now to leverage this crisis to shift how we look at doing school and looking at the whole child, looking at social emotional, which is a lot of you are spending time on, is really a great space because the outcome is that kids will do better in school. But we got to really reprioritize what is it we want to really see happen. And ultimately, discovering the gifts of our children is a really important space. I use the word brilliant. Asa Hilliard talked about that. Like, there's no kid that's not like a genius, right? Who comes through our system. They're all geniuses. We just have to discover that and recognize every kid, their success may happen at different spaces in their time that they're in schools. So I challenge you to have your own definition of equity. Okay, have your own and go through that process so that you can apply that lens to every single thing we do. Everything we do, our budget, our instructional practices, when we're on the play yard with our kids, when we're interacting with our parents, student nutrition, transportation, I can go through the whole gamut. We have to apply that lens, but it's hard to apply the lens without the definition. So I want you to look at your notes and make sure you have that as on your to-do list, is you got to define equity. Even if it's not clear within the space that you're working in, that's the work you got to start with, because we can't apply our lens if it's not something that's established yet. And so I'm going to leave you with this and then just pause for a moment to see if there's maybe one question, is that there's an article that is actually in your resources that I'll share with you, and actually has been shared through follow-up with you all around what equity is and why it's so important that you focus on it, and the concept of equity benefiting all kids, because you have a finite amount of resources. And so what happens is you're going to have to think about, how do we prioritize those that have the most needs? And so this article is a great example. It's called the curb cut effect. Great example for you to think about, how do we take our finite resources, focus on that target group that really needs the most support, and then see how it benefits all. And so that is ultimately really important when we talk about what it means to define equity and really focus on that so that it drills to the classroom. So I'm just going to pause for one moment and see if we have just one question, and then I'm going to jump into the barriers of the work. So Amanda and Mickey, if you have anyone that pops up, maybe one question you may want to share, and then I'll jump into the next content space.
Nicole, I don't see any in the chat. I do see a question with a vote.
Perfect.
But I think it's probably something you're about to embark on when we're talking about what it looks like when we walk in a classroom where
absolutely
responsible learning is in action. What does that look like?
Sounds good. All right. Well, let's jump into it. Hopefully y'all are all right. Oh, go ahead,
Nicole,
Dr. Ayala. Yes.
Please call me Carlos, Nicole.
Yes, sir. Carlos. Yes.
The slides will be available for folks, and then this webinar is being recorded, so people will be able to go back and get into the chat and get the links too. So
absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the reminder. Absolutely. And so let's jump for a moment, just a brief moment, to talk about recognizing some of the barriers to equity. So once we define it and are really aware of what it looks like, and really understand like where we're going, like it's our why. Now, how do we recognize those barriers that get in the way? What is it that's stopping us from having this equitable outcomes for our kids? And we have to really be conscious and strategic. And so one of the things I want you to think about is one, thinking about your data. Okay. And so I want you to think about the data that currently exists. Like what is it that's a problem, right? What are those gaps? And so I want you to think about it from a quantitative lens. So many of you spend time looking at data all the time, and the quantitative hard data that comes right out of your computers, right, that you collect all the time, your achievement data, your discipline data, disproportionality around how kids are placed. You have all of that, your master scheduling, all of that shows inequities. And this is a great place to start the work. Like, what do I do to create equity? And for those of you that are like, okay, well, I don't know what I don't have, or I don't have access to all this, this is something that with your teammates, you're going to have to really come together and be very, very intentional about, is we have to look at where are the issues first. What are those challenges? What are those gaps? So I know where to put our time, our people, and our money into this issue. Because remember, equity is about giving kids what they need. And ultimately, it's about giving the kids, that kid in purple, right, who needs the most in that picture. How do we look at what the needs are? What is the issue? So then we can go into understanding the root cause, why it's a problem. So these are things to think about, your quantitative data. But as all of you know, our public can go to the data dashboard. They can see the CAS test. They can see, all the data, it's public information. But the reality is this, we all know that's not the whole story. We know that some of our kids who may be the high achievers doing really well in school, actually social emotionally may not be doing well at all, right? There may be some discipline issues. Our kids who are actually in the office a whole lot are brilliant kids who actually may just not have the right engagement in their classrooms, right? They may not have access to what they need. So the reality is that we don't have the whole story. Well, how do we get the whole story? I'm going to also ask you to think about your qualitative data. So earlier I mentioned student voice, right? Huge. We're going to have to make sure we collect in more of our kids' experiences in the classrooms. So think about your surveys you're using, think about observations, which I'm going to walk you through a tool that you can use. And then also interviews, right? We talk to kids and families all the time. We just have to be intentional about the questions we ask and be bold and courageous to ask those things that are deeper than what we've been normally asking. Really be vulnerable as leaders, as educators, to hear the experiences of those we're serving. And your engagement data, many of us don't think about this, but what is that engagement, that representation of those voices in the spaces you already have? That's a data point that'd be very interesting to collect, because sometimes we forget that change happens through actually having an empowered voice of those who have the least amount of power. So again, 2 data points, qualitative and quantitative, to help you really make a decision on what the problem is. What is the equity gap that exists? So in your notes, you should be thinking about, like, what am I going to spend my time on? And really narrow your focus based on the data, not based on your feelings or emotions, but based on the data. Now, what is this? Why is it important you understand what these gaps are? For many of you who are from the elementary space all the way to the high school space, some of you are in higher education, literally, we have to recognize that these gaps we see in schools now actually can permeate into the adult world. So when I work with city councils and work with governance teams who are working with the adults in our society, right? Our county supervisors, you name it, this is the data they have to wrestle with. And as educators, one of the things important for us to understand is when we talk about student success, we often don't collect this data, which is after our kids leave the system. And so when they're 35, how are your kids doing that left your school districts and your schools? When they're 40, what does that look like? I call it the voices of alumni. What is their lived experience now? And so this is data that's important for you to actually recognize how you're going to address equity for a 5-year-old, for the 10-year-olds. Okay, very important to be conscious of why your data loop has to really include when they leave your system, which is another body of work. So you may want to think about how you partner with folks who do have this data. Partnering, we talk about school boards, always partnering with the city councils and those 2x2s, and being very intentional about how we're going to address this equitable outcomes for kids, which then shows up in society. And all of us, I know this matters as adults, right? We don't like seeing this data be negative in our communities. So this is why it's so important that we invest in understanding what it is now. But let's go a little deeper. I'm going to challenge you to think about, in the space you work in, you got to think about why these gaps exist. Why on our dime in 2022, our dime right now on our clock, that we have kids who are showing up to school, brilliant, amazing kids, but are not being served well in our system. Why? So let's unpack that for a moment. And the way I want you to unpack that is through one of the many challenges, which is our history. Okay. And many of us as educators who have gone through the school system, our credentialing process, we never got a chance to really sit down and think about, like, what's water? Well, the water, the conditions we've been swimming in didn't just show up today. Okay, my grandfather, as I mentioned, he laid a foundation. He had a different experience in school. He went to a school where it was fully segregated, right? He went to a school where it was just one room, right? And only African-American students were in his class. because of the laws and the policies that existed. But lo and behold, we had advancements in our system. And so understanding those advancements through policy, right, through those ways that laws that have changed to actually integrate schools and create equitable, I should say equal access to our students who have shown up as marginalized or not been served well in our system intentionally from the beginning, you're starting to see those advancements have happened. But somehow, again, why do these gaps still exist in 2022? And so this activity, I encourage you to actually go through individually and also with your colleagues and unpack it over time. Because what you're going to find is that in the system, you will see that we've made great advancements. Many of you who are on this webinar now, you would not be sitting where you're sitting now if it wasn't for the shoulders we stand on and for some of the changes that have happened historically. And so I always want us to remember that, because we don't want to blame and shame about what happened in the past and not also recognize that we are here because of advancements. However, we still have work to do. And what we got to understand is our system was never designed to be equitable. And because of that, we have to really recognize what those issues were so that we don't perpetuate and repeat history over and over. The timeline, just so you have a reference to it, actually is within the PowerPoint, and so you can actually pull it up. But I'm going to show you the couple of things just to think about when you think about why we have some of the gaps we have. Well, first and foremost, just be clear that starting back in the 1600s, schools were not designed to be based on the curriculum around Houghton Mifflin and Pearson and all the great stuff you teach in your classrooms. It wasn't centered around serving all students with a lens of equity. It literally was around just being there to serve what you notice, elementary age kids, people who have wealth, right, land, and also our European brothers and sisters who migrated here to this country. And so you have to remember it was only for a certain group of people. Now, here's the reality is that there was still advancements. Thomas Jefferson's quote always reminds us that there was now an opportunity for some to be raked from the coals and or raked from the rubbish. And many people have a lot of emotions about this quote, but you got to pause and think about what this means. In this work, you see Thomas Jefferson proposing a two-track system, and we see sometimes that two-track is still existing now. But the reality is there were poor people who were not educated at the time. And so now this was an opportunity for people who weren't landowners to be able to be a part of this. But again, we're not talking about girls, we're not talking about people of color. We're just looking at a small group of people to be educated. And so when you fast forward, if this is the foundation of a system, no wonder we're taking so much time to really create change so that all kids can be educated. But many of you have done your history, you know that as we've gone through this particular process of learning about history, you'll find that these advancements have happened where we started to open the doors for many of our students. But you also always saw with every advancement, you saw pushback, which is what you see now in 2022, right? Is that every time you have an advancement in education, you saw pushback. Everyone didn't believe in this. Hence Brown versus Board Education, where you all saw us have desegregation cases, Mendez versus Westminster. These were all cases that actually were around creating access for more students. But what happened, you had everybody didn't believe in that. Hence why you still have segregation in every one of your school districts. And so we got to be really conscious of that, because this history is actually what keeps us perpetuating these gaps. So without being aware of it, then what we'll do is we'll continue to perpetuate not only the policies, but then the practices won't change and our mindsets won't change. And so I'm going to give you a couple things to think about, like, what does this mean in our classrooms, right? What does this mean? And so I want you to think about for a moment, Dr. Pedro Nogueira, who's one that I just highly respect, but he shares a little bit of a perspective that I want you to think about. And as he closes out, what I'm going to do is share with you a couple of things to think about practically in the classroom to address some of these historical barriers. Carlos, that sound okay?
The most recent racial justice movement sparked by the police killings is a reminder that even the most blatant forms of racism have not gone away. And as significant as they are, what worries me is that we'll focus only on the most extreme examples of racial injustice and ignore the ways in which racial injustice is baked into the system. The Supreme Court in 1954 said, separate and unequal is blatantly wrong, unconstitutional, we need to stop it. We never stopped it, but we pretended we did. And I would say that in the No Child Left Behind period, we acted as though schools were operating on a level playing field, and therefore we could hold every school, every student accountable to standardized tests, even though we hadn't done the work of extending equal educational opportunities to all kids and in all schools. While we like to celebrate the exceptional individuals who are able to use education to improve their lives, help their families, that's not the norm in America. What is the norm is that there are lots of people out there with talent and ability who haven't had the opportunity. And because of that, they are in low-wage jobs permanently and stuck in a cycle of poverty. And that should trouble all of us, because the whole idea behind the American dream is that we want a society that doesn't reward birthright and privilege, but rewards effort and talent. And we're very far from that. And the data shows an affluent student with a C average has a much better chance of graduating from college and earning a good job than a low-income student with an A average. Imagine if as a society we said, look, we are seeing the inequities, let's do something to reduce them. That would lead to a massive reorganizing of the way we deliver instruction, for example, moving away from talking at kids to much more interactive, much more applied learning, because that's the way kids actually learn. We make them schools that are developmentally focused on the needs of children. We would emphasize relationships. You can look at schools that serve poor children well, Black children, Latino children, Native American children, and then what you have to do is change the conditions in schools, and that produces better outcomes for large numbers of kids. You don't have to change the kids or their culture.
Powerful. And I know many of you are familiar with Dr. Pedro's work, and continuously, I love hearing him speak and remind us of some of the things that are really critical when we talk about, again, reimagining what does student success look like, understanding the history and understanding our role. And so what I want to do in kind of our closing, our last 15 minutes to just close out, is I want to give you some practical things to think about when we say, what does it mean to actually create equity? And Dr. Pedro brought up, relationships, and he talked about developmentally focused in our space. And so I want to give you a couple of things to think about practically in a classroom. And what I'm going to share with you is a connection to Maslow. So I mentioned that earlier, because remember, no matter who kids are, no matter what their identity, it doesn't matter. Okay, I want to say that in a very clear way. It doesn't matter when you look at the data what kids' identity is, because this Maslow's applies to all human beings. So take the labels out, is why I say that part doesn't matter. Take the labels off and just think about all kids. Every single kid that walks through your doors, Maslow's needs to be in place. Take their grades away, discipline, all of it. Does Maslow's fit into your classroom? And that should be a starting point. You should have an assessment. Does every single kid have Maslow's in place? And if you don't have that, then you're going to have a really hard time creating equity for every kid. But let's just start there. In the classroom, kids by name, is Maslow's in place for them? And that's going to require relationships with the families to be able to understand what's going on at home. It's going to require a relationship with the student to ask their story so you can understand what they need. It's going to require you going to CUME folders. I know that that's not always the funnest process to go sit and look through folders, but know their story. Right? Not to find out the dirt on them and why they're misbehaving and how many suspensions they had in their elementary school, but it's to go find out what worked well for them. What was their journey? Where did you see changes in their past? Right? What worked well? Talk to other teachers they've had, people who had relationships with them. You got to make sure we know what they need. Okay? Be very conscious as you look at kids come through. You can feel it sometimes. You can see it. So being very present and proximal with kids is important. Now, what does this look like when we talk about the 4 indicators of equity? So I mentioned this earlier, that we have an equity walk tool. which is actually included in the Google folder that you'll have access to. And in this tool, I'm going to break it down for you in a moment. There's 4 indicators, and these particular indicators all correlate to closing equity gaps, achievement, any gap that we talked about earlier. Okay, all those quantitative metrics that you have. So again, cultural identity, relevance, relationships, and rigor. So I'm going to break those down for you. And let's just start for a moment with talking about cultural identity. So the reality is that we need to know who kids are. Okay, culture is about my belief systems and why I do what I do. So if you don't know who I am, then it's going to be very difficult to connect to me. So knowing who kids are, what does that look like in the classroom? Their stories are acknowledged, they're valued, and they're represented in all teaching and learning. So as a student, do I see myself in the curriculum? Do I see myself on the walls? Are you acknowledging I'm even present? Do you respond to me well, even when there's a conflict? Many of you are seeing kids right now who are also impacted by the racial conflicts, and the N-word is flying around. We got kids saying things to each other. And ultimately, our teachers, we got to be equipped to be able to address that conflict. We can't be paralyzed because we don't understand how to address racism as adults. But our children, they need us to manage conflict, and it's just where differences happen. So teaching around being aware and valuing every student in the classroom, cultural identity is really important. Making sure kids have their own personal learning plan. I know that's a lot of work, but have kids set their own goals and help them buy into what they want to in terms of being successful in your classrooms. So that's going to be really important. We talk about who are kids, what is their cultural identity? Do you know who they are? We cannot skip that step. Why? Because we have to make it relevant. So you all are focused on culturally relevant instruction. Well, how can I make it relevant if I don't know who you are? So relevance is really about centering this around our kids' diverse experiences, right? Their interests, their learning styles, not just talking at students anymore. It's not just putting out the same curriculum that we've used, which may not be relevant to them. We have the ability to have supplemental materials. We have the ability to create lesson plans and engagement strategies that can keep kids really connected to their real life experiences. One of the best ways to do this is ask kids what they're interested in. What is relevant to them? If you knew me as a math student in your class, you would know that I was a great basketball player. I actually got a college scholarship to play at Oregon State University. Go Beavers. And the reality is this: math totally relates to the basketball court. If my math teacher thought about it in geometry, like, oh my gosh, Nicole, you wouldn't have turned the ball over as much as a point guard if you understood angles better, right? You can't pass the ball from that angle. Go on to the wing and pass it to the post player from a different angle. Connections, right? That's what related to me versus just talking at me. Let's open the book and I'm just going to regurgitate what I saw on the screen. Like, that is really important. We recognize having the ability to have multiple strategies. And so you see a laundry list of things here to connect to, but ultimately it is important that real world issues be connected to our students. And we as instructors in the classroom and as instructional leaders observing this evidence, we're going to have to continue to think about relevance is connecting to kids. It's not just about my ethnicity. Yes, I need to see myself in the curriculum, but I also need to have a real world experience as a young person. Because relevance based on the generational gap may also be our issues in our school systems as we speak, is we have age differences. So what I think is relevant as an adult may not be relevant to my teenage child. And so I want us to think about relevance is something, again, what's water? It's not always what we think it is. Ethnic studies is a great example of how we're trying to be more relevant when we teach history, right? When we teach multiple truths about different people based on ethnicity. But even we got to be careful within ethnic groups. There's diversity. We don't all have the same experiences. And this is where we really get stuck as educators, is our biases, our blind spots. We sometimes will still put kids in a box. They do not all have the same experiences, even when they have the same labels. So this is where we have to unpack the concept of stereotypes and all that bias that as instructors, sometimes we will assume it's relevant and it's not. So this is what I want to really emphasize with the concept of relevance. But again, you got to know me to make it relevant for me. Now, the relationship piece is the center of Maslow's, right? If I don't authentically have a relationship with my students and I'm not cultivating a space where there's a sense of love and belonging and respect, then it's hard for me to learn from you. right? It's very hard to learn. And so what happens is in the relationship space, this is about authenticity. This is about knowing kids by name. It's about recognizing and celebrating who they are. It's about being really conscious of our body language in our classrooms. Especially now when we have kids who've been disconnected for a year and a half being on distance learning, the body language and human interaction, the cultural exchanges we lost. And so it's hard to build a relationship authentically if I can't see the whites of your eyeball, right? If I can't have an interaction with you. And sometimes we forget that this is so critical when it comes down to the teacher actually wanting to instruct your student, and then there's no connection. So then the student actually mentally blocks you out, even though they may be sitting there quiet and they're nice and respectful, but ultimately they are in a space where they just haven't engaged because the relationship is not there. And so one-on-one time, making sure that we actually, and I know this is hard because we have limited time when we talk about our teachers' space in the classroom and the ratio of teacher to student, but it is important that one-on-one time be a part of the teaching and learning process, because ultimately that positive interaction is going to impact student achievement. The last one that I want to share with you is rigor. And it's really important we talk about teaching and learning. I know that rigor is a big deal for us, right? Like, we're educators, we are in the business not to be friends with kids, right? We're not in the business to be fluffy and nice and cozy with kids. Like, some teachers really will struggle with that. I'm in the business, I signed up to teach, right? So I have this rigor that I have to create. But I want to be clear that rigor is about high expectations and a deep belief system that all kids can learn. So what this means, this is more about mastery, right? Is I'm going to make sure I meet you where you are, and I'm going to refuse to let you fail as a student. You are going to master what I am teaching. That's what rigor is. Sometimes we get lost and we think that rigor is lots of homework, and we think that rigor is exposing kids to a bunch of different forms of curriculum. But if I am not mastering the skills and concepts that you want me to leave with, then what happens is we see what we see. We see kids who don't turn in homework, right? We see kids not doing all the tasks and the long, laborious things that I've seen my sons go through. Ultimately, it's about high expectations. So we know lesson objectives, right? Being standards-based. We all know these things. These are all basic things. But I want us to think about, for equity, high expectations. Remember, stereotypes and bias is real. So sometimes rigor shows up where I'm going to water it down because I feel sorry for you because you don't have food to eat last night. I'm going to feed you when you come to my class, and then I'm going to ensure that I'm going to expect that you're going to still learn from me. That's a big deal because kids rise to the occasion of our expectations. But as long as Maslow's is in place in that foundation, then what we see is rigor, higher order thinking, culturally relevant text-dependent questions. Those are all the things that we know are best practices. But it is really about, with the equity lens, it's about our high expectations and really is debiasing our experiences as instructors in the classroom. And so in closing, I want to just leave you with this. You know, you're kind of like, okay, Nicole, that was like drinking water through a fire hose. A lot of information, so much that we could cover. These are workshops and days and years worth of content to go deep into. But I want you to think about where you can go next. Okay, one, utilizing that equity walk tool is a really great thing to start thinking about. Do these things happen in the classroom? Am I measuring relevance, relationships, rigor? Am I actually measuring those? Cultural identity. Do I even have data on who our kids are? That's the starting point. Is Maslow's in place? That's where we start. But we also are going to have to start with us. This is an opportunity, again, to unpack that question, what's water? And who am I in this body of water that's been swimming in it for years and years? And what is it I don't know that I need to really engage in a much more efficient way as an equity leader? Put my oxygen mask on me first. And so as you think about your closing thoughts, and what comes to mind for me is one of the best ways to think about this is, again, educational leaders. We're not going to close these gaps in schools if we don't close the one in our minds first. And I am speaking to each one of you as educators, no matter what your positions are, no matter how far advanced you are in your equity leadership journey, we have never arrived. And so we're always working on shifting our mindset to address the needs of our kids, which are evolving every single year that they come to our space. And so as you deal with the pandemic, that through our equity lens. And I know it's going to happen through your change of policies and practices that are ultimately going to create equitable outcomes that will last for our students. And so I'm going to pause for a moment, share the information that I just shared. If you all want to have access, again, it'll be a follow-up sent to as well, but go ahead and feel free to get the slide deck. And also there's several resources that I share with you that I encourage you to read through, just the process. How are you going to lead this work specifically to drill down into the classroom to support our teachers, to hold them accountable, but in a loving way where we can literally shift the system and create equitable outcomes that will last for generations. This is our legacy work. And so I'm going to pause for a moment and see what questions and discussion we can have through our webinar format. And just really appreciate the opportunity just to share a little food for thought as you continue to build on this journey for equity for our kids.
Thank you, Nicole. Thank you so much. It definitely wasn't a nibble or a snack. That was quite a bit you shared with us. So we appreciate that. And we want to thank everyone for submitting their questions in a pigeonhole. That's very helpful to hear what your thoughts are and some questions that you would like Nicole to respond to. So I'll start with the first one that comes up. The question is, how might we go about decolonizing educational barriers and breaking down those barriers within our school sites and district? What baby steps might we be able to do now, today?
Yeah. Great question. So it's a deep one. You use the word decolonization, right? Like that's such a deep space to go into. So I won't be able to give you the long answer to that. But the short answer, I think, again, goes back to, I think about decolonizing our minds first, right? Because I, as an educator, have been put in a space where I've been taught to do school a certain way. So often what happens is, even in my social justice, equity warriorette space that I've been in since the day I was born, because remember, I come from lineage, right, who they have fought for this, bled and died for this. So it is who I am. I'm intrinsically an equity leader because it's part of how I was raised. But the reality is that I also have limitations to my experience. And so in that, like my own mindset, I'm going to give an example of grading, right, is I graded a certain way. I always graded based on, one, how my teachers, how they modeled for me when I went through school, right? So I've only known a certain way. And I wasn't liberated by a school system to tell me I could do something different until I went into Bethel High School. And what I found is that example for grading is that the mindset of my principal at the time, who's now a school board member in the school district of Vallejo Unified School District, the principal at the time had the mindset to think about high expectations for kids, and we refused to let kids fail. So the grading system actually was shifted to A, B, C, I. Now, in my colonized mind, right, I was used to seeing grades a different way. But my core beliefs really connected, so it actually worked well for me as a teacher. But you can imagine when I'm in a system where I have kids going through the school, through my classes, and I cannot give a D or F, meaning I can't fail you, right? That was wonderful. It forced me to teach, right? I had to make that I was the incomplete. I had to teach until they got it. But you can imagine that there were many of my colleagues who still had a different mindset. Even though the policy was very clear, like you can't go in Aries and give a D or F, it wasn't available. And so when I think about decolonization, one of the things is we got to think about it from a systems approach. Is that part of why that system doesn't exist today, unfortunately, at that same high school, is because the system approach wasn't utilized. And I talk about this with my mentor now, who was the principal at the time. And I'll give you an example just through the slide deck since it's still up. I actually meant to pull it down, but since it's still up, I'm going to give you an example. Is when you think about a system approach, we had a great policy. And in this policy, if you notice on the left-hand side through that water system change framework, we had a policy for grading. But unfortunately, that policy didn't resonate with everyone's mindsets. And so because we didn't necessarily approach it with, let's get people to come together and learn about equitable grading practices, which is what people are doing now, which I'm excited to hear with Joe Feldman and lots of different people who are really working on changing grading practices. The decolonization process, even for well-meaning people who only have been swimming in this water doing it a certain way, you have to start with mindset and belief systems. and making it really clear that people who don't actually have a say in the grading system, meaning our teachers who they can give grades, but they don't necessarily set policy, right? That's where school boards and leaders fit in. So having that power dynamic, right? Sitting down and saying, let's talk to each other with people who have less power. Let's hear what our kids have to say. That's a way that I was liberated, is hearing my kids, right? And that's how I changed my mindset, is hearing the students tell me, like, Miss Anderson, like, that ain't working, right? And us adults have to think about it in that way. But because we're talking about generations of doing school a certain way, and unfortunately thinking about those barriers, that history of public education, we have to chip away slowly but surely through building relationships, through ongoing professional learning for our staff, with follow-up, and also with clear accountability metrics, even for our adults. But it has to be a balance of support and accountability. It can't just be changing on people, force them to do it, not give them a chance to buy in and decolonize their own mind as well, if that makes sense. Because remember, we all have been swimming in this system a long time. So we can't assume people are just going to pause and do something differently, even though they love kids and they signed up to do the best for kids. So hopefully that helps a little bit on that particular one. I really like that question. Like I said, we can do a whole nother hour on just that one alone, because the history of public education is a tough one. Ooh, you got a lot of work to do on that. More questions?
Nicole, thank you. One question posed was, there's so much confusion among culturally responsive pedagogy, critical race theory, and ethnic studies. How would you go about communicating the differences between these three to the stakeholders within a district or in your community?
Yeah, well, it's to me, it's pretty simple. I think one is, I go back to the concept of defining terms, right? So I would encourage people to pause for a moment, just take a deep breath, and then learn what they are. So take time to understand, what does critical race theory mean? Okay, to be very clear about a theory, keyword theory, that is not embedded into curriculum in our educational system from K-12. That is a higher ed space that people have still not recognized. Most teachers don't even know what it means. They actually have confused it with culturally relevant teaching, right? So I think even the acronym has to be unpacked, right? Because culturally relevant teaching, which I shared earlier, right, is about making the curriculum relevant to your students, right? And so that culture piece, we got to unpack the word culture. So the word culture is not necessarily ethnicity. It's not just necessarily someone's language. Culture is a large body of forms of identity of a person that makes up who someone is, their belief systems. And so I think it's important to unpack the terms themselves. And that's a starting point. Ethnic studies, again, sitting down and actually unpacking what ethnic studies is, and ultimately the curriculum in itself. And so you can actually look at CRT. Well, you don't really have curriculum to compare, so you might as well throw that out the conversation. That is not taught in schools. I think has to be very clear. And what I often say to people with communication, especially our boards who are getting, questioned, leaders who are being questioned, is to go back and remind people about your curriculum adoption processes, right? That you have a whole process for adopting curriculum. You actually physically have textbooks that you can actually pull out and show. And I always laugh at it and I go, we're not even equipped to teach something like critical race theory, because we don't have an awareness of what it is. So I think it's really important to define terms for ourselves, so then we can have a way to communicate out. But right now, I think the confusion of those is that we aren't clear what it is ourselves as educators. And so we need to pause. And I think it'd be great for leaders who have the opportunity to do professional learning, that you actually give the space and time for our educators, our teachers, our principals to actually talk about just that. What is ethnic studies? Do we even teach it here? Many do not, right? Especially in the elementary level. What is culturally relevant teaching or instruction? Let's unpack that. Do we teach that here? What is it? So that we actually can see the outcomes happen. What is critical race theory? So that we can dispel some of the confusion. And so I think just giving that space and time, and this is where leaders really have to have the vision for that, is to give the space and time to define what these terms are. I would literally just start there. And that will eliminate a lot of confusion, but also to give some clarity on, okay, if I want to be a teacher who has culturally relevant teaching practices, it's really around what I shared earlier. It's about, I got to know what culture is. and who my kids' culture is, right? What is that culture for them? What is it for me? And then how do I take this curriculum that we've been instructed to use, that's been adopted, and connect the two? And that's really important. And so I think that's really a safe space to be with all people, because again, racial conflict is real, and the lack of safety right now is real. So it's really important for me that people have a safe space to, one, acknowledge our adults' cultural identity and who they are and what their fears are and what their you know, the safety they need to say, I don't understand this, or I don't agree with this, I don't like this. Like, we have to create those conditions as leaders. And without that, then what will happen is the confusion will continue. And then even culturally relevant teaching will be something that people will be hesitant on doing, because they will think that someone is going to say that I'm not teaching this correctly and I'm teaching about race. And it's really important that we just dispel those things through just having conversations, even with people we may not agree with. Let's create the space to have a discussion and define those terms.
Thank you. Another question that got a couple of votes here, not counting the person who actually posted it. So thank you for the question. The question is, how do we focus on the students that need the most support without making other students feel slightly neglected?
Ooh, yeah, that's powerful. Wow, I can envision the classrooms where that happens, right? And so one is, let's just go back to those 4 indicators and let's just think about relationships, right? So if we have a group of students in a classroom, I think the first step is, let's ensure that in our checklist of things we do first, let's make sure relationships is intact first. Do I know every kid by name? And do I pronounce it correctly? Like, that's a big deal, right? And for a teacher, that's actually really easy activity to do, but it's actually really difficult because you have a lot of kids, right? And for a secondary teachers who have hundreds of kids, like, it's a tough one. But first step is, you neglect kids by not having a relationship with them. The next piece is know their story. So what is their story? Again, what's their identity? Let them do storytelling. Give activities that provide kids an opportunity to share who they are. Proximity is important too. The quietest kids, a lot of times we ignore them because they're quiet, right? So a lot of times we think about proximity. I know COVID has really kind of changed the dynamics for this, but physical proximity is really important, because human interaction helps to really negate that neglect, right? When you actually can come to someone and have eye contact. Many teachers have taken on the practice of greeting kids at the door. Spending time really using exit tickets, for example, to make sure that you get feedback from kids on not only what they learn, but also, like, was this relevant to you? Was this interesting? What could be better about this lesson? Like, getting feedback from kids in multiple ways is a way to not make them feel neglected. But also, I think having the one-on-one time. So when you think about like the rigor piece of it, one-on-one, when I think about like frequent meaningful feedback around teaching, right? I taught this lesson. How do I know my kids got it? And so that requires time in a classroom. And I know teachers struggle with this because you have limited time, but it is important. And we talk about rigor. How do I know that my kids mastered this? And that requires us to have a touch point with every one of our babies. We can do it in small groups. I know that that's something that secondary folks have used, right? Having the small group learning, which is important anyway, and empowering kids to be able to have a voice. So facilitation is important, to make sure kids have roles in their teams, right? Make sure that every voice is heard. It's really critical, but ultimately it's about intentionality. Like, I have to have like vigilance. Like, I have to be looking to make sure, did I touch every kid today? Not physically with my hands, but did I connect with every kid? And that's not really that hard to do. It's hard though, because it's not something we've been taught to do as educators, right? We've been taught to give information and kids sit and get, right? And then they leave and we think like that's teaching. So I think that's the best way, is just to shift our mindset about how we approach the relationships with our students. And then again, let's use the data, right? Because one of the most frequent ways we neglect kids is we see data, but then we don't do anything about it, right? We see they're struggling. We know they're struggling, but we don't do anything about it in a timely manner. We do it and it's too late, right? And so we have to have like the frequency, the timeliness to be able to really respond to their needs. And that's what equity is, right? It's giving kids what they need. But if I don't know them, I can't give them what they need. So really important. Maslow's, though, I mentioned that. I don't want to reiterate that too much, but Maslow's is a great way to not neglect our human beings called children.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Nicole, this next question is in reference to the video with Pedro. He shared, instead of focusing on the extreme examples, focus on those baked into our system.
Yeah.
What are some recommendations for opening up the conversation with teachers? Where and how?
Yeah. Oh, it's a tough one. One of the things that when I think about like the role of a principal, for example, who's the ultimate instructional leader at a school site, is one, being aware of the larger, racial inequities, right? Like understanding the history of public education is a great starting point. Looking at the history of and the impact of race on particular student groups based on the data is important. But then it's also being really clear about their comfort level as a principal to talk about race. I think that's going to be important before we even talk about teachers, right? Because I think people forget that our leaders have to have the courage to be able to have a courageous conversation, as Glenn Singleton talks about, right? Courageous conversations about race. So I think the starting point is leaders have to have this space and grace to be able to learn about racial inequities themselves and how it impacts them. But then the other thing would be that how do we now translate that to the classroom? So one of the ways that I really think is critical is that principals create teams, right? So you do this in team formats. You don't want to do it as individuals, and think about those who are believers in the work, those that are really interested in the work, and create a team. Like have those, some use committees and task force, you name it, but do it in a format where from a person who has power, like a principal has power. So I would never want to try to infuse addressing racial issues by me telling people how to do it, right? And I want to just give a caveat. As a former principal, as an African-American woman, I recognize the dynamics of my identity, and that me and that message about let's address the issues of race at our school, knowing there's African-American kids at our school, I know that might have gotten in the way of my message. So my strategy may look very different from my other colleague who may have been a male, who may have identified as a different ethnicity than me. So it's really important that we recognize our own identity first before we try to lead racial equity work. Now, where do we go with our teachers? One is, remember Maslow's is about all kids. So I always recommend with folks, don't enter this work through the lens of race, because the readiness in our system is not there. Let's just be clear. Okay, as a large scale process, you're not going to address the racial inequities in a school site. So I recommend the best way, and go back to that Ruth Bader Ginsburg approach, is I want to bring people along. So I'm going to approach and enter through the lens of culture, which applies to all kids and all adults. And I'm going to enter through the concept of the Maslow's piece, because it applies to all humans. And then I'm going to enter through data. And I'm going to enter through showing that data and making sure that the data is something that we all look at, right? So this is where staff meetings come in, the PLCs, you name it, to really allow the groups of teachers to look at it and tell me what they see, right? I think that's important, and tell each other what they see. Because if not, then what happens is we're telling people about racial inequities, and then what happens is people don't really own it, they don't understand it. Now, the trick to this is that as you go deeper into looking at data, we do want to be very mindful that data inherently has its own racial kind of inequities baked into it, how we collect it. So our census data is based on limited numbers of boxes that people can mark, right? I think in our California data is like, what, 8 or 9 boxes based on ethnicity. That in itself creates perpetuation of racial inequities, right? Because we're telling people you have to be in this box, we're going to put a label on you, and if you have this label, then that tells me how I'm supposed to treat you. We got to interrupt that if we're going to do racial inequity work. And so you can do that work without actually calling it racial equity work. All you need to do is look at the data and then force ourselves to start looking at cultural identity. So what I've asked certain schools to think about when we want teachers to recognize the needs of kids is, when you do your registration packets, when you do surveys to parents, let's shift our language from just race and ethnicity to cultural identity. That's one great way to start interrupting the labels and the stereotypes that are attached to our kids who are most historically impacted, right? As Carlos, you said, our Black and brown students. I mean, literally, that's what we're seeing. But let's take that label off for a moment and let's start to demystify what it means to be Black or brown. Let's start looking at cultural identity, because I have 3 kids who identify as Black, but all 3 of them have different needs. That looks different for me as a teacher than if I say, I have 3 Black kids in my class. So that we have to simplify this for our teachers, right? I also think about equity has to be on the agenda. Racial equity has to be on the agenda. So staff meetings, PLCs, you name it, as we've defined what equity means for our kids at our school, now let's take that lens and let's keep it on the agenda. It applies to all things. We bring our campus supervisors in, our noon duty supervisors. We're talking about supervision with an equity lens. And we're looking at data. Who are the kids that the supervisors are always sending to the principal's office? Let's talk about that. And then you got to balance it though. You got to have professional learning. So every staff meeting, have a chance for people just to learn, right? They got to be able to learn. They have to be able to unpack it so that when we talk about now the instructional practices, people buy into it. They actually understand it. And now they can actually start to change their mindsets and implement in the classroom. So I hope that helps a little bit when we talk about racial inequity, when you want to address that in a classroom, because it's a difficult one, but I never recommend entering through race primarily, because you're going to lose people, right? If we just know that that's the most uncomfortable thing that adults have been conditioned to talk about. So why would we use that as a leveraging point to interrupt racial inequities in the school? And I know some people will say we can't water it down, right? And we can't just cater to people based on their comfort levels. And what I always say to people, well, how is that working for you? I want you to go ahead and try it and see what happens. And we've seen it happen over and over. But I'm a living witness, right? I got to see my teachers change their practices as an African-American leader because of relationships with them, because I allowed them to be a part of the process. I had to empower them. We had to look at the data together. I couldn't tell them about the gap. I had to let them see it, right? It's a process, and I had to allow them to fail, right? And not blame or shame them every time they sent a Black boy to my office. I had to balance that out. And eventually they stopped sending them to my office because of changes that I also had to make too, which ultimately for principals who are on the call, being in the classrooms has to be like, I would say 90% of your job. I know right now it's really hard, even though most principals are like, I'm in classrooms because we have a shortage of subs, a shortage of teachers. So I get it, but this is like what we should be doing. Principals shouldn't necessarily have to think I have to teach lessons every day, but literally in the classrooms, having that proximity to our students, being on the playground, that is where we can actually interrupt racial inequities in our schools by being present and seeing what those issues are, and then cultivating a culture to make change. So I'll pause there.
Do we have time for another question, Carlos? One more? Okay.
Perfect.
I think one of the questions that has arisen to the top here goes along with a little bit of the history you shared about the 2-track system.
Yeah.
And so the question is, now, all too often, we're hearing that not everyone should be going to post-secondary education. What are your thoughts on this matter of who should go, should not go? It's a different kind of conversation.
It is. Well, first, it's like, I don't think I have the right to tell kids where they should and shouldn't go, right? Like that had to be a real epiphany for us as educators, is we shouldn't be telling kids what they should be doing. But I do want to say this, knowing the history and the purpose of public education, remember it evolved, right? So it went from, it was literally just teaching concepts of the Bible, right? And being literate through religion, through beliefs. Then it went into, remember, industrial revolution. Now we needed people to work in factories, right? So as you think about like what success means in education based on where we are now, we're going to have to rethink that. So is going to college considered success? Is working in a career field other than like, the trades and you name it, is that success? Is being like a Nicole Anderson, a woman entrepreneur, is that success, right? Some would disagree. Right? My mom would see it totally different. Like she's totally supportive, but my mom worked 40 years in a job where she was told you have a job, right? You get benefits and salary, and being a consultant and a business owner is very different for her, right? So she finally is like a believer in it, right? But she was like, are you sure you want to leave your job at AXA? Right? Literally defining success, I think, is where we're going to have to do. So that way and I'm now going to bring up our counselors, who I love our counselors, but they also need support in how to rethink how we support kids, because they are, I don't want to say a gatekeeper, but they're ultimately ones who work closely with principals during the master scheduling process to place kids in our system, right? Through the master schedule process. And so we got to think about, what is that end result? What is it that's considered success for a student? because we have also done things like taken wood shop out, right? We've taken out auto shop, we've taken out things. And again, I could be a business owner of an auto mechanic spot where I know my cars need that, right? If we tell kids that that's not success, then what are we doing? Because their talents and skills, again, go back to the definition of equity from the National Equity Project, discovering and cultivating the talents and skills and gifts of every student. So in education, if we can redefine success, then the narration for kids who don't go to college will look very different, right? But then I want to flip this for a minute. There are kids who don't have access to go to college, hence why we shifted to A through G, right? And aligning that with our graduation requirements, because we had kids who were not on track to go to college because we were telling them you can't go. I have a great friend who literally graduated from Cal Berkeley with a bachelor's, went to Harvard, got her master's, and got her PhD at Stanford. Now, from a lot of us educators, we're like, that's a pretty nice resume, right? Well, guess what her counselor told her? You can't go to college. You should take these classes. Had it not been for her vice principal who intervened, you wouldn't hear that story. And so I say that as kind of a flip side. We have to define success and be very clear with our counselors, with our teachers, with our administrators, and across the entire school district. When we hand a diploma to a kid, they have the option to do whatever they want. And I think that's a different conversation. Now, I'll leave you with this last piece. Many of us as adults may have found that we didn't realize success till we were like 30. I don't know about how you felt, but a lot of us are like, wait, I didn't really realize what I wanted to do or figure out my career path till my brain developed and I had lived experiences, I matured. So one of the things we're gonna have to do in education is we're gonna have to be much better as we redefine success. We have to get more of our stories of our alumni, right? Because remember, just because I didn't go to college when you thought I was going to go doesn't mean I didn't go when I turned 30. And that's very important to recognize, that the timeline for success, we're going to have to rethink. And that's data that we're going to have to collect and stand really connected to those who've already left our system. And so that way, the history of public education, as you all rewrite the timeline moving forward, right? Success shows up in a lot of different ways, but ultimately your portrait of your learners, your profile of your graduates, right? They should always reflect things that are beyond just grades, right? Test scores. And going to college, I emphasize it for my children and I emphasize it for many students, but the reality is that I celebrate success for all kids based on their talents and skills, and that they can contribute to this society as a citizen who is not showing up in the prison system, right? Not showing up with health disparities and all those things that I showed on the slides earlier. So I think, in ending, again, we got to reimagine student success, and doing it through the equity lens. I absolutely encourage you to do, and just really appreciate being with you all today. Great questions, and my information for anyone, they can definitely reach out, send a text message, an email, give a call. We're on this journey together, and just really honored to lock arms with you all. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Nicole. Just reflecting on your presentation, it was a hose full of water, let me tell you. But I learned a lot in your presentation. The focus on Maslow's needs and how you intertwine that with equity and culturally relevant education, and how that is a way forward to begin to address the racial inequities that are in place. That's brilliant, and I really appreciate that. And for everyone who's here listening, if you want more of these kind of things, if you want more opportunities to interact with Nicole, let us know here at GIA, or let Mickey Inbody or Amanda Corridon know about this as an opportunity for us to bring people across the Inland Empire together to figure out how we can create a community that can move things forward. So my deepest gratitude to you, Nicole, and your understanding of where we are and where we need to go, I think is, like I said, is brilliant. One final note in closing. In 2 weeks, we have another webinar that we are going to host, the last one in our series on building better from disruption. It's going to be about recovering from racial inequities. And Dr. Sean Harper from the USC Race and Equity Center is going to be the presenter there. And Nicole, you're welcome to join as a participant if you'd like. And I'm hoping that many of you can participate in that work too. Again, Nicole, thank you so much for your time, and thank you all the guests who were here to listen to Nicole, and great information. I believe we have a little survey we need to provide. I don't know if that's going to be dropped into the chat or not, but I hope that it is. So thank you again, Nicole, and thank you all of you for attending today. There's a survey there. Please complete it. We need your feedback. Bye.